Jeffrey Stewart was shot. He was murdered.
Yes, we know that.
And I want to make sure, quite sure, sir, that the same thing doesn't happen to Miss Valesco.
Why should anybody want to murder Miss Valesco?
I didn't say anyone did want to murder her, sir.
But you inferred that they might.
You say you came here to negotiate with Miss Valesco on behalf of Mrs. Stewart.
Yes.
What happens if you don't succeed?
Well, that's it. Mrs. Stewart's had it.
Then I wish you the best of luck, sir.
Look, Inspector, forgive me, but I think you're just a little bit confused.
Confused, sir?
Yes, about me, I mean. I couldn't care less whether Mrs. Stewart does a deal with Miss Valesco or not. I've got no axe to grind. I am working for Mrs. Stewart. A glorified messenger boy.
Oh, I see. Well, in that case, you're quite right. I am confused. I'm just leaving, Miss Valesco. You have my telephone number in case you need me.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
If you're worried or puzzled about anything, don't hesitate to ring.
You're very kind, Inspector.
Diana? Can you hear me? It's Jeffrey. Listen. Listen to what I'm saying. You've got to identify the body. They've got to think it's me. Do you understand? I'll phone you again tomorrow morning at 12 o'clock.
Now we know why Mrs. Stewart thought it was her husband on the phone.
Yes, but how can you get a recording like that, sir?
A good recording engineer can take sentences, even single words, from half a dozen tapes and string them together.
I see. I'm afraid there's still one or two points, sir.
Let me put you in the picture booth. As you know, this tape recorder and these spools were found at Kitty Tracy's. Every single spool is a recording of a private conversation. Jeffrey Stewart with his wife, Mark Paxton with Mrs. Stewart, and so on. Someone, and it obviously wasn't just Miss Tracy, went to great lengths to get these recordings, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you why.
Blackmail?
Exactly. Now, in my opinion, Kitty Tracy and her unknown partner, let's give him a name for the time being,
Ned Tallboy?
Yes, all right, Sergeant Ned Tallboy. Kitty Tracy and Tallboy discovered that Mark Paxton and Mrs. Stewart were having an affair and planned to murder Jeffrey Stewart. They let the plan go through for the simple reason that at a later date they
intended to blackmail Mrs. Stewart.
Right. Unfortunately for Ned Tallboy, at this point, a friend of Kitty Tracy's, Ken Harding, came into the picture. Harding knew what they were up to and threatened to go to the police unless he was cut in on the deal. Ned agreed to this, but later on became suspicious. He thought that Miss Tracy and Harding were ganging up on him. So he decided that the only thing to do was to get rid of Harding. He murdered him, dressed him up in Jeffrey Stewart's clothes, and dumped the body out of Benchley Wood. Then, by means of this so-called telephone conversation, he persuaded Mrs. Stewart to identify the body as her husband.
Why should he do that?
If you committed a murder, what would be your number one problem?
Getting rid of the body.
Exactly. And as soon as Diana Stewart had identified the dead man as her husband, Ned Tallboy had in fact solved this problem.
I see what you mean. He was banking on the fact that it might be months, even years, before Jeffrey Stewart was found.
Yes, and he didn't murder Stewart, remember? He had nothing to worry about so far as this murder was concerned.
Yes, of course. Well, we certainly seem to have pinned it on poor old Tallboy. Tell me, sir, when did you first realize that Mark Paxton and Mrs. Stewart were having an affair?
Oh, I had a hunch about that quite early on. Then one afternoon I dropped in on Paxton. Apart from seeing a cigarette she'd been smoking, I noticed her handbag on the settee. What is it, Miller?
There's a Mr. Walter Bowen outside, sir. He'd like to have a word with you.
Yes, all right, then show him in.
Oh, thank you. Very good of you to see me, Inspector. Oh, morning, Sergeant. Good morning, sir.
Won't you sit down, Mr. Bowen?
Thank you.
What can I do for you, sir?
Well, frankly, I don't know that you can do anything, Inspector. It's just that I'm rather worried about my wife.
In what way, sir?
Well, she was a friend, or rather acquaintance of, look, Inspector, I think I'd better come straight to the point.
Might be a good idea, sir.
Miss Tracy was blackmailing my wife. Thelma used to go there, to Miss Tracy's, once a month. She went there the night that Miss Tracy was murdered.
Go on, sir.
Well, that's it. That's what I came to see you about.
That's very interesting information, sir, but I would have preferred to have heard it firsthand.
What do you mean?
Why didn't Mrs. Bowen tell me about this?
Well, she was frightened, and besides,
Yes?
My wife and I have had a row. As a matter of fact, we've split up, for the time being, at any rate.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, it's just one of those things. It's inevitable, I suppose.
Does your wife know you come here this morning, Mr. Bowen?
No, she doesn't. That was what the row was about. I told you you'd find out about her visit to Miss Tracy's, and unless she came here straight away, she'd probably be suspected of the murder. She just wouldn't listen to me.
What was Miss Tracy blackmailing your wife about, do you know?
No. No, I'm afraid I don't.
And you say that she went to Miss Tracy's on Wednesday night, the night of the murder?
Yes, she had an appointment at 7 o'clock.
Tell me what happened.
Well, Thelma left the house about 7:15, and about an hour later she returned. She was in a dreadful state. She was both frightened and distressed about something. When I asked her what had happened, she refused to talk. And the next morning, when I questioned her again, she said that when she'd arrived at Miss Tracy's, the murder had already happened.
You mean she saw the body?
Well, I don't know whether she actually saw the body or not. She flew into a panic and rushed home.
I see. Well, thank you, Mr. Bowen. You've been very helpful.
Oh, Inspector, if you talk to my wife about this, I'd be awfully grateful if...
We'll be discreet, sir. Don't worry. There's no reason why Mrs. Bowen should know you've been here.
Thank you.
Where can we get in touch with you, Mr. Bowen, if we want to have another chat?
Oh, I've taken a job, a temporary job anyway. Do you know Clayton's, the bookshop in Oakfield?
Yes.
Yes, well, I shall be there for the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Thank you, sir.
Mrs. Stewart's been trying to get hold of you, sir. She telephoned your office 3 times.
Yes, I know. I've been out all morning. Are you taking the afternoon off, Mrs. Houston?
Yes, I'm just popping over to Oakfield to see my married sister. They just moved into a new house and I promised to lend them a hand.
Yes, well, I should take an umbrella if I were you. It looks as if it's going to rain.
Oh, Mrs. Houston, I thought you'd gone.
No, I'm just off.
Give my regards to your sister. Say I hope she likes the new house.
Yes, I will.
You look tired.
I didn't have a very good night, I'm afraid. I've been trying to get you on the phone. I've been trying all morning.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry, darling. I had 2 important appointments. Well, I've got quite a lot to tell you. I saw this girl, Diana Valesco. We had quite a long chat together.
What's she like?
Do you want me to be frank?
Of course I want you to be frank. If I didn't want you to be frank, I wouldn't have asked you.
Diana, what is it? What's the matter?
Tell me about this girl.
Well, she's Italian, very good looking. And Geoffrey was obviously in love with her.
How do you know? How do you know Geoffrey was in love with her?
Diana, what is the matter with you? Do you want the truth? Do you want to know what happened last night, or don't you?
Go on.
It appears Geoffrey met her about 6 months ago. They bumped into each other in Chelsea. I mean, literally bumped into each other. She was running for a taxi, Geoffrey was crossing the road, and wham! She hurt her foot pretty badly, so he put her in the cab and took her home. That's how it all started.
You came like a bat out of hell.
Yes, he used the phrase when she bumped into him. She didn't understand it. Later, when they got to know each other, she asked him what it meant. He tried to explain, he even tried to translate it into Italian, but it was impossible. It became a sort of little joke between them.
A rather costly little joke, I imagine, as far as Geoffrey was concerned.
I don't think so. It's my impression this girl's had very little out of him. She didn't even know about the will until I told her.
I find that hard to believe.
It's true.
What happened when you did tell her?
She's worried. She's frightened you're going to contest the will.
I am going to.
Diana, listen, I've had to talk to this girl. She's not what you think she is. At the moment, she's very hard up.
What do you mean, hard up?
Diana, if you contest that will, it'll be months, maybe years before anybody gets anything out of it.
It's not what you said yesterday.
Yes, I know what I said yesterday, but that was before I met this girl. She's prepared to do a deal with you. She's told me quite frankly that if you can let her have £10,000, now, straight away.
You want me to give you £10,000?
No, not me, this girl. Don't you understand what I'm talking about?
Read this letter. It came this morning.
What is it?
Read it.
What the hell does this mean?
Don't you know what it means?
Diana, don't be an idiot. Put that thing away. Good God, you think I'd walk out on you
Yes,
at a
I
time
do.
like this?
You are walking out on me. That's why you want the £10,000, not because the girl asked
Diana,
you.
for heaven's sake, some little bastard sends you an anonymous letter, and the moment you get it, you think I'm walking out
It's no
on you.
use, Mark.
What do you mean?
I checked with BOAC the moment I got the letter.
Yes, well, I can explain. I can explain about BOAC. Someone at the office asked me to make a reservation.
Lying! You're lying!
I am not, honestly, darling.
Sorry to bother you, sir. Can I use your phone?
Inspector, hello. Yes, of course. Come along in.
I was just getting some petrol and suddenly remembered a call I had to make. I see you've read the paper, sir. What a terrible business.
My God, you can say that again. When I saw the paper this morning, I just couldn't believe it. Inspector.
Yes, sir?
Look, I probably oughtn't to ask you this, but did you know about Mrs. Stewart and Mark Paxton?
Well, I suspected they were more than just friends, if that's what you mean, sir.
Do you know, it never crossed my mind. Not for a minute. Yet now you come to think about it, he was a good-looking chap. They were always together. I'm beginning to think I'm a bit of a dimwit.
Oh, I wouldn't say that, sir. You just haven't got a suspicious nature.
But that's just it. I have, as a rule. I suspect my own grandmother. Inspector, how did the row start? I mean, what triggered it off?
A letter, sir.
A letter?
Yes, Mrs. Stewart received an anonymous letter saying that Paxton intended to ditch her.
Is this the actual letter?
Yes. As soon as she received it, she checked with BOAC.
And he had made the booking?
He made the booking all right. He was flying to Sydney on Monday afternoon.
The little rat walking out now like that.
May I, sir?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Inspector.
I'm only ringing the office, so it's not private.
Yes, well, I've got some work to do myself this morning.
Inspector Clay's office?
Miller, put Sergeant Booth on. Will you want a word with him?
I'm afraid he's not here, sir. He went over to Oakfield about an hour ago, sir.
Oh. All right, then, Miller. Doesn't matter.
Inspector, there's a Mrs. Bone here, sir. She wants to see you, sir. She says it's urgent.
Mrs. Byrne? All right, tell her to wait. I'll be there in about 15 minutes.
I just didn't believe it. I refused to believe it, even when Mrs. Houston, the housekeeper, told me it was Diana herself who telephoned for the police. I just
Mrs. Byrne, I appreciate the fact that Diana Stewart's a friend of yours, but I'm sure you didn't come along here just to talk about her.
No, I didn't.
Well, what did you come to tell me?
Well,
Go on.
I want to talk to you about Kitty Tracy, about what happened the night she was murdered.
I was hoping you'd say that. Go ahead, Mrs. Byrne.
About 2 years ago, I bought some jewelry from a man called Ken Harding. It was stolen. I knew it was stolen at the time. Like a fool, I sold it to a customer of mine. 6 months later, I did the same thing again, and then, well, we did several deals together. And one night, Kitty Tracy rang me up. She didn't say what she wanted, but she mentioned Ken Harding by name, and she hinted she knew what was going on.
That was her technique, I'm afraid. First to make you curious, whether she made sense or not, and then to scare the hell out of you.
About a fortnight after her phone call, she asked me to call round and see her. I've been calling round to see her ever since.
How much did she get out of you?
£200 in cash every month. See, she had some papers I'd signed, papers I'd given to Ken Harding when I...
Tell me about Wednesday night, Mrs. Byrne.
Well, I got there at about 7:15. I used to go into the shop and straight up the staircase. She was usually sitting there waiting for me. But on Wednesday, when I got to the top of the staircase, I realized that she wasn't there and that the place had been ransacked. I was just looking around the room when suddenly someone rushed out of the bedroom and hit me on the back of the head. Well, I managed to get as far as the landing and then I passed out.
Did you recognize who hit you?
Sorry, Inspector, I didn't. They came up behind me.
Mm-hmm. What happened then?
Well, I must have been unconscious for about 10 minutes. When I came round and remembered what had happened, well, I just ran out of the shop and went home.
Didn't you look for Miss Tracy? Didn't you go into the bedroom?
No, I didn't. I knew something had happened, something dreadful, and, well, I just didn't want to get involved in it.
Mrs. Byrne, you say that Kitty Tracy was blackmailing you and that you paid her £200 a month.
Yes.
Was it only just a question of money? Didn't she sometimes ask you to do things for her?
Yes, she did. She made me lie to Diana about that phone call, the one that was supposed to be from Geoffrey. There wasn't a phone call, of course. Geoffrey was already dead.
She wanted Mrs. Stewart to go to the motel to identify the body.
Yes. But why? I never understood why.
Mrs. Bowen, I'm going to tell you something about Kitty Tracy, something you don't know. Although she was blackmailing you, Miss Tracy actually worked for a man called... well, let's call him Smith for the time being. Smith was the real blackmailer. He really ran the racket. Then one day, Miss Tracy and your friend Ken Harding decided to set up on their own. It's my guess you were their first victim. Smith found out, lost his temper, and murdered Harding. He then tried to cover up the murder.
By passing off Ken Harding as Geoffrey Stewart?
Right. But Miss Tracy had been fond of Ken Harding, and she decided not to let Smith get away with it. She knew that once we found Geoffrey Stewart, we'd be curious about the other body, the one at Benchley Wood.
And was it Smith who murdered Kitty Tracy?
Yes, he was obviously searching for something when you disturbed him, and I think I know what he was searching for. I don't want to frighten you, Mrs. Bowen, but I think you'll be hearing from Mr. Smith.
What are you doing here?
Well, that was obvious. I've been waiting for you.
Look, Walter, I told you yesterday.
Selma,
I haven't the
this is
slightest
important.
Walter, it's no use. I'm not lending you another
Selma, listen to me. This is important. I've got a message for you. It's about Kitty Tracy.
What do you mean about Kitty
Someone
Tracy?
telephoned me at the bookshop. I didn't know who it was, but... Look, we can't... Yeah, come on, get in the car.
Now tell me again. Tell me exactly what
But
happened.
I've already told you.
Walter, please.
It was lunchtime. I was alone. Clayton had gone to the bank and I was sorting out some paperbacks. The phone went and a man's voice said, I want to speak to Walter Bowen. When I said it was me, he said, I've got a message for your wife, Mr. Bowen. Tell her I've got the papers that Kitty Tracy had. Tell her I'm prepared to do a deal. £4,000 in cash. I'll telephone you this time tomorrow.
That's all.
Yeah, that's all he said.
And you didn't recognize the voice?
No, I didn't. Thelma, what was he talking about?
Walter, I want you to do something for me. When he phones tomorrow, tell him I'll meet him at Paddock Grange.
Paddock Grange? The Stewart place?
Yes.
But why Paddock Grange?
I'll be there at 2 o'clock. I'll have the money with me, £4,000 in cash.
All right. I hope to God you know what you're doing.
There's the key.
Did you see Mrs. Stewart?
Yes, I saw her just for a few minutes.
How is she?
Well, she's upset, of course, but she's bearing up pretty well. You know, it's a funny thing, but I almost feel sorry for that woman.
Then remind me to keep off the jury, Bull.
Oh, I know. Strictly speaking, she's a bad lot.
Strictly speaking, you're a sucker, and if you'd been married to her, you'd be a dead sucker by now. Claire?
Mrs. Bowen is on the line for you, sir.
Right, put her on.
Inspector,
Yes?
this is Thelma Bowen. I've heard from our friend. He wants £4,000. I've told him to meet me tomorrow at 2 o'clock.
Good. Now, we've got the door key. One of my men will drop it into you later. Now, don't worry, Mrs. Bowen. Everything's going to be all right.
What about Mrs. Houston, the housekeeper?
She'll be out of Paddock Grange by the time you get there. Don't you worry about that. Mrs. Bowen, how did you get this message?
He telephoned my husband.
When?
At lunchtime today.
I see. Thank you, Mrs. Bowen.
What's happened?
It looks as if it's fixed. Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock.
At Paddock Grange?
Yep.
Why Paddock Grange, sir?
Well, where would you have the showdown, Boo?
At the shop at Mrs. Bowen's.
In the middle of Allenbury.
Yes, sir, I get the point.
I'll take care of that, Thelma. Excuse me, sir.
My husband was here when I arrived.
The inspector ought never to let my wife come here alone like this. Didn't he realize what he was doing? Something might have happened to her.
You've handed the money over, sir?
Yes.
And our friend's still in the house?
Yes?
See, Tallboy hated Mark Paxton. He was jealous of him. That's why he sent Mrs. Stewart the note.
About the BOAC booking?
Yes. I made a copy of the note and showed it to Tallboy. He fell for it. He said, is that the actual note, Inspector?
Giving away the fact that he knew damn well it wasn't.
Exactly. If he hadn't seen the original, he wouldn't have questioned. Here he is. Mr. Tallboy, I know you're a dab hand with cars, but even you can't start one without the rotor arm.
I replaced the rotor arm, sir.
Thank you, Sloan.
Leave this with me, sir. I'll take it back to Tallboy's place.
Thank you, Sergeant, but I'll take care of this if you don't mind. It may interest you to know, Booth, but this isn't the first time I've handled one of these.
Yes, well, take it easy, sir. They can go like a bat out of hell.